departure as well from the Palace of Westminster, and that will be the formal end, if you like, of the state proceedings today, as politics then kicks in again. And I suppose at that point, Andrew, I'd say to you, for the Conservatives, people are very happy to recognise around this table today that there are elements in this which are attractive and there are elements in this which are desirable, even if they don't get everything they would like to see, because everyone has different political needs. It's just the deliverability of it. It's just the reality of it, or the lack of reality of it, and the fact that, you know, given the circumstances we're in, you genuinely are not in a position to deliver any of this given the current climate. Now, that's what viewers will find puzzling.
Yeah, of course, but viewers should remember that this government was forced into this position by the House of Commons refusing to grant the government's wishes to go to a general election. We started this programme talking about how it is usual to have a general election and then a Queen's speech outlining a programme for government. Well, we were precluded from doing that because the House of Commons refused to go to the country to actually test what this government was offering with the people. And so we are here today with the Queen's speech, which, as you said, would be very difficult to deliver. But wouldn't it be great if we could? If we could deliver Brexit on the 31st of October and then go on and deliver this really ambitious and positive agenda for this country. And to turn to Joanna's comments about ignoring the needs of the people of Scotland, you know, the immigration bill that will come forward will be a really positive immigration bill for the entire country. Freedom of movement, of course, is ending because we're leaving the European Union, and with our leaving the EU ends freedom of movement. But I personally would like to see an expansion of the seasonal worker scheme pilot. Joanna's right, we absolutely do have needs and priorities in Scotland that are different to the rest of the United Kingdom, and that's why I would like to see an expansion of the seasonal workers scheme where we can attract the workers to Scotland that we need to keep the economy thriving. And of course also Scotland will benefit through the Barnett consequentials with the increased investment in the NHS and schools and infrastructure, everything that will mean in terms of the uplift to the Scottish Government's budget to spend on the priorities that they see that Scotland need north of the border.
As we see the Crown and the regalia leaving, Laura, I'm bringing you back in and ask you point blank whether you think Ed is justified in saying that this is a fantasy Queen's speech. Is that going too far?
I think it's a colourful way of describing it, but I think it's certainly a, shall we say, a Queen's speech from a parallel universe where Boris Johnson, where Boris Johnson gets his way, where Boris Johnson is able to get a deal with Brussels definitely done by the end of this week, definitely through Parliament on Saturday with a thumbs up, thumbs down, meaningful vote, definitely then getting through all the Brexit legislation that has to happen after that, and then definitely being able to get his way and have a general election within a few weeks, and then definitely getting a Conservative majority. Right. So a lot of hurdles to get over in that kind of Downing Street dream scenario. But I think we shouldn't dismiss too much the idea that this just doesn't mean anything. It does mean something. What it means is this is what we are likely to see as the basis of a Conservative manifesto in the election that will come sooner rather than later. But I would caution, you know, everybody at the moment is working on, oh, could it be December the 5th? Could it be the last week of November we'll get into an election? Things have been so topsy-turvy around here in the last few weeks. There are some people in government who just still say, I don't think it will happen this side of Christmas now. Now, the conventional wisdom is that it will, because the government doesn't want to go on like this. There is a suggestion, particularly among the opposition parties, that the SNP is keen to push for a vote of no confidence to have an election more rapidly than the Labour Party is. So there are sort of tensions there, but nothing's certain. Nothing is certain at all.
What's your hunch on election timing, Jenny?
I mean, I'm listening to what Laura's saying. I think she might have a point, but my sense is, having listened to that, that's clearly a pitch to the country, you know, weak though it is. And I think that we need an election, and it needs to happen fairly shortly, because
does that
we just
mean
can't
Labour will
carry
eventually come round to saying we need one?
It's not that Labour doesn't want one. It's just we wanted to prevent no deal. I mean, this has all been about making sure this Prime Minister doesn't take us off a cliff. But once that's been assured, however that assurance may come about, then we just have to have an election. We've got to move this country forward. That Queen's speech won't do it, and the people need a chance to pick something better. What's likely to happen on Saturday in that emergency session? What will MPs, viewers will want to know, what will you be asked to do on Saturday? What is the function of Saturday?
Well, if the Prime Minister brings back a deal, that will be debated and voted upon, and then subsequent to that vote depends an awful lot. Right. Of course, if he doesn't have a deal, he's required under the Benn Act which had cross-party support, to ask the House of Commons if they want a no deal. I'm pretty sure that will be rejected because it will be absolutely disastrous for our country. And then he will be forced by Parliament to ask the European Union for an extension. If he does that, the real question then is it election or a referendum? Liberal Democrats believe that the referendum is the better option to solve the question that has paralysed Parliament and paralysed our country. A general election would involve inevitably other issues. A referendum is a clear question, and whether there's a deal or not a deal, that clearly is the right way so we can put this back to the people with all of what we know now and then bring this to a head and get it done.
Saturday. What's likely to happen?
Well, I agree with Ed about what the Prime Minister is bound to do in terms of the Benn Act, and of course he has given a solemn assurance to the court in Edinburgh that he will not only do what he's required to do under the Benn Act, but that he won't seek to frustrate its purpose. So all this nonsense that people like Andrea Leadsom have been coming out with about sending a letter requesting an extension, then sending another letter saying we don't really want an extension, that would fly against the promise that the Prime Minister has given to the court. Of course, the court have held the hearing open to the first working day after the 19th, so myself and my colleagues who've raised this petition can go back to court on the 21st if Boris Johnson breaks his promise. So, yeah, I mean, but you're right about the SNP position. Once the extension is in the bag, we would like to see a general election. This Queen's speech talked about the government caring about the prosperity and the integrity of the Union. If they cared about the prosperity and the integrity of the Union, they would listen to what voters in Scotland want and what Scotland's Parliament wants. They don't. We're sick of this. We want a general election and we want to move towards a second independence referendum. OK, I'll come to Andrew for a final word in a second. I want to go to Vicky, who's in the central lobby with Caroline Lucas.
Yeah, that's right. The view from the Green MP, Caroline Lucas. What is your priority this week, and particularly on Saturday when the House of Commons will be sitting?
Well, actually, my priority right now in the wake of the Queen's speech is on climate change. And if I can just say a few words about that first, because important though Brexit is, the climate emergency is the real question of life and death on this planet, and we've just had 6 words in a subclause. That is all that was afforded to the Queen in her Queen's speech by Boris Johnson. So that is letting down young people massively. Looking forward to Saturday, yes, of course, the big issue is whether we can get a people's vote on that Brexit deal. I think it's absolutely important that this issue goes back to the people for a final say.
Do you think that the numbers in the House of Commons have changed, though? Because, as you know, the option of another referendum has been rejected by the House of Commons.
It's been rejected, but it got very, very close. It was within touching distance, and I think that now we're even closer to the cliff edge, if you like. I think more and more MPs are now accepting from both sides of the House, both Labour and Conservative, that the right thing to do here and the way to get the majority is to put the deal back to the people.
Would you be willing to support a caretaker Prime Minister or Jeremy Corbyn in the event that Boris Johnson is voted down in a vote of no confidence?
I have always said that I think that Jeremy Corbyn, as leader of the official opposition, ought to be given the opportunity to lead that caretaker government. So I would absolutely support him in that decision. And it seems to me that we shouldn't be playing party politics at this point. This is about the national interest. The national interest right now is to make sure that that letter gets sent, to get the extension to Article 50. I think the national interest is about getting a people's vote, a confirmatory referendum on the deal. And if by doing that we need to support Jeremy Corbyn, then I'd be very glad to do that.
OK, Caroline Lucas, thank you very much indeed. So after the debate today on the Queen's speech, of course, a few days of debate before the House of Commons sits again on Saturday.
Vicky, thank you very much, and thanks to all your guests. Just a couple of minutes to go. I want a sentence from each of my guests, and then we'll end with my colleague Laura on how they would sum up today. What has today amounted to? Andrew, for the Conservatives.
I'd sum it up as being quite exciting. It set out an ambitious, forward-looking, one-nation agenda for this government that we want to deliver once we've delivered Brexit on the 31st of October.
Joanna?
A meaningless and expensive distraction from the broken politics of Brexit Britain.
Concise and clear. Thank you very much. Jenny?
I think this was intended to be the firing of the starting pistol at the beginning of a general election campaign. He's fired a blank. There's not enough there, and, you know, the country deserves better than this.
Thank you. Ed?
This was a Boris Johnson stunt. Discourteous to Her Majesty, and shows, I think, to your viewers that we have a Prime Minister who can't be trusted.
Where does it leave us for the days to come, Laura, because we've got the summit coming up, and how do you see the rest of this week playing out?
Well, as you suggested, there'll be a couple of days now where MPs will scream and shout over the measures that have been put forward of the Queen's speech, but all eyes really are on what will happen at the conclusion of the important summit in Brussels at the end of this week, before a mega day, Super Saturday here, when MPs will be trying to find a way forward. But given the difficulties they've had in doing that over the last couple of years, I wouldn't expect that there's suddenly going to be an outbreak of peace and harmony, but we'll see.
OK, Laura, thanks very much once again. And can I thank all of you for being so constructive and being very happy as well to kind of knit the politics together with the pageantry, because it's not always easy to do. So thank you for being so cooperative with that. That's it from Westminster for now, from the Houses of Parliament. We're inside the House of Lords, actually, just a stone's throw from the chamber itself, where it was all taking place. Thanks to the guests. Coverage of the debate on the Queen's speech will continue, of course, on the BBC News channel this afternoon. There'll be plenty of detail as well on BBC News Online on the individual measures announced in the Queen's speech itself. So plenty of BBC material for you. So we've seen the first state opening of Parliament for 2 years, but it's at least possible that we'll see a second before the end of 2019. Let's see, shall we? From all of the BBC team at Westminster, thanks for watching and goodbye.
You've been watching a BBC News special on the Queen's speech. We'll have lots of analysis about events at Westminster throughout the day here on BBC World News. But here on GMT, it's time to bring you up to date with some of the day's other news. They were once enemies, but now the Kurds and Syria's President Assad have forged a deal mediated by Russia. Syrian government forces have already started moving into strategic locations in the northeast of the country to counter the Turkish offensive. The Kurdish-led administration in northern Syria has said the Syrian army would deploy along the entire length of the border as part of the agreement, although little is known about what exactly Damascus has committed to. Meanwhile, areas under the control of the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, the main US ally in the area, have come under heavy bombardment from the Turkish military over the weekend, with Turkey making gains in two key border towns, Ras Al Ain and Tal Abyad. Dozens of civilians and fighters have been killed on both sides. Well, amid the chaos and the power vacuum left by the Americans, who last night announced that all US troops in the area will withdraw, some are seizing opportunities. Yesterday, some 800 family members of Islamic State fighters escaped captivity from the camp at Ain Issa. So how are the Kurdish Syrians affected by these recent changes? The BBC's Alim Makboul is on the Syrian border with Iraq.
Well, the area you can see behind me is currently under Syrian Kurdish control, but the way things are looking in the coming days or hours even, who knows, this is going to revert to Syrian regime control, and that is just one of the tumultuous events that people here found it so difficult to grapple with. Remember, just over a week ago, the White House, in effect, endorsed a Turkish invasion plan. Since then, we've seen an assault from Turkey. We've seen many Kurdish deaths. We've seen destabilization. We've seen Islamic State group fighters escape when the facilities that were holding them were shelled. And now, in this extraordinary turn of events, we've seen the Kurdish administration that has been in control of some territory since the end of 2011, small pockets that expanded to cover around a quarter of the country. They have now said, because the US troops are leaving, they want the Syrian regime to come in, fill the void, and take on the fight against Turkish forces. And Syrian Kurds have been left with just another thing. After having sacrificed so much in the fight against the Islamic State group, they have now been left reeling and unable to predict what chaos will be brought on them tomorrow.
Aline McBall there. There has been outcry in the US state of Texas after a black woman was shot dead by police through the window of her own home. Atatania Johnson's death was recorded on the police officer's body-mounted camera. You may find some of what we're about to show you upsetting. The officer, who is white, had been called to the scene in the early hours of Saturday after a neighbour noticed her door was open. He walks around, checking the property before spotting a figure at a window.
Put your hands up! Show me your hands!
Well, the footage does not appear to show him identifying himself as a police officer. Fort Worth police say he has been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. Tanya Johnson's family's lawyer has demanded justice over the incident. Let's have a look at some other news now. More than 110,000 people are taking part in search and rescue operations in Japan in the aftermath of Typhoon Hagibis, the most powerful storm to hit the country in decades. More than 40 people were killed. Whole towns remain underwater. Many of the deaths came as people were buried in landslides or swept away by floodwaters. Tunisians have been celebrating on the streets of the capital, Tunis, as exit polls predict a landslide victory for the independent candidate Kais Saied in the presidential runoff. Mr. Saied campaigned on what he called the values of the Arab Spring uprising. His rival, the media magnate Nabil Karoui, was only released from prison days before the vote. The Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he plans to continue campaigning as normal, a day after he wore a bulletproof vest to a political event because of an unspecified security threat. His rival candidates have condemned any threats to any political candidates. Lengthy jail terms have been handed out to 9 Catalan separatist politicians for their role in Catalonia's failed attempt to declare independence from Spain in 2017. The region's former vice president was jailed for 13 years for sedition and misuse of public funds. That was the longest jail term. His former boss and the regional leader at the time, Carles Puigdemont, has called the sentences an outrage. He is in self-imposed exile. Well, let's take you to Guy Hedgecoe now, who joins us live from Madrid. Guy, just bring us right up to date with some of the reaction there's been to the sentencing.
Well, that's right. These sentences range from 9 years to 13 years. As we heard, 13 years for sedition and misuse of public funds for Oriol Junqueras, the former vice president of Catalonia. And these sentences have today already brought very different responses. We've heard from Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez, who has defended the Spanish judiciary, defended the sentences, says that they are fully credible and that he will continue to defend Spanish democracy. We've also heard from the president of the Catalan region, Quim Torra, who has been very critical indeed of them. He says they're anti-democratic and unjust. He has demanded talks immediately with Pedro Sánchez. So we're hearing very different responses to these sentences today already.
Guy, there had been talk of a campaign of civil disobedience on the streets of cities like Barcelona. There's heavy security in the region, I know. Has there been any sort of response on the streets?
Well, the response has been immediate. As soon as the verdict was announced, pro-independence Catalans were out on the streets of Barcelona and also some other towns and cities across Catalonia to express their anger at this verdict. We're expecting a lot of social unrest, not just today, but over the coming days against this verdict and these sentences. We don't know exactly what the nature will be of these protests and this unrest. There are concerns on the part of the Spanish government that they might turn violent. 2,000 extra police have been deployed to the Catalan region. So at the very least, we're expecting a lot of tension, and that tension has already begun today.
Guy, thank you for joining us with that from Madrid. Let's return you now to one of our top stories, the situation on the border between Turkey and Syria. We can take you straight to our correspondent Martin Patience, who joins us now from right there on the border. Martin, can you tell us more about this deal that the Kurds have struck with the Syrian government? This represents a massive shift in terms of their alliances in the region. What do we know about the deal?
Absolutely massive shift. I mean, what we have to remember, a week ago, Lucy, the Kurds were backed by the Americans. Now the Americans have pulled out, Turkey's invaded Syria, and the Kurds are now looking for a protector. They believe they've found it in the Syrian government, although a senior Kurdish commander said it will involve inevitable compromises. But he says the position that the Kurds were in simply meant they had no other choice. According to some reports, it's purely a military agreement whereby Syrian troops will push up towards the Turkish border in order to support Kurdish fighters against Turkey. Now, it's worth pointing out the Syrian army has been hollowed out by 8 years of conflict. But what you have to remember is the Syrian army is backed by Russia and Iran. So they must have been across this deal as well. And it just complicates the battlefield. But from the Syrian government point of view, well, they now feel they can move into large areas of northeastern Syria. That's territory they haven't controlled for several years.
And Martin, in terms of the humanitarian crisis that is surely evolving, what's happening on the ground?
Absolute chaos. I mean, it's very difficult to get information out of the ground. We know yesterday, though, that a convoy with civilians and journalists in it was hit just outside of the town behind me, Ras Al Ain, and there's been shelling, continued shelling inside that town, a key town inside Syria. People are moving southwards, and the reason they're moving southwards is that's away from the bombardment. But then, of course, the Syrian government is moving northwards. So I think many Syrians on the ground will not be feeling safe, and they will not be feeling protected from any side, from Turkey, from the Kurds, from the Syrian government as well. So it really is absolutely chaotic there.
And Martin, what's happening at these camps that had been detaining Islamic State fighters and their families?
Well, we know that there was a big apparent breakout yesterday. According to the Kurdish version of events, it was attacked by Turkish warplanes, but we also heard the guards may have simply let the women and children from that camp leave. There was no IS fighters as far as we know, or certainly not many of them. The most dangerous of them are being held in different detention facilities. But I think from the Kurdish point of view, they will say this is no longer our problem. America, you have not supported us. Why should we bother looking after all these IS fighters when we can simply release them and they can go to Europe where you can deal with them? So there's a great deal of bitterness on the Kurdish side because they feel betrayed, particularly when they feel they've done all the heavy lifting in regard to the fight against the Islamic State group.
Martin, thanks so much for joining us. The BBC's Martin Patience there. K-pop fans are mourning the death of the singer Sulli. The 25-year-old's manager found her body at her home near Seoul. The star was a member of the band FX until she left in 2015 to focus on her acting career. Police say they are investigating the cause of her death and are working on the assumption that she may have taken her own life. Let's take you live to Hong Kong now. Pro-democracy protesters have gathered at Chater Garden. It comes a day after China's President Xi Jinping issued a warning against dissidents, saying any attempt to divide China will end in bodies smashed and bones ground to powder. So you can see the scene there in Hong Kong.
Hello there. More of an autumnal flavour now starting to evolve across Europe. It stays pretty unsettled over the next few days. You can see one weather system waiting in the wings, another one pushing in, and that will bring some rain as well. Sandwiched in between the two frontal systems, there will be drier, brighter interludes. You can see on Tuesday across much of Eastern Europe, it's a relatively quiet story, but that wet weather moving out of France, Germany, into the Alps as well. So the Mediterranean continues to stay fine and settled with temperatures into the high 20s for one or two spots. There will be a good deal of dry weather into the Balkans, heavy rain across northern Italy, snow to the Alps, and then some showers into France. And it has been a little more unsettled into Spain and Portugal, with more wet weather waiting in the wings. It's rather cool as well into Scandinavia and breezy with it. And those temperatures are obviously just going to get a little more subdued as we go through the week. So this is the story then. Tuesday into Wednesday, the next system pushes in. Much of the Mediterranean stays fine and settled, with those temperatures still peaking in the mid to high 20s in some spots. So the city forecast for the next few days: London and Paris keeps that autumnal flavour and temperatures easing down a little. Madrid and Rome dry, settled and sunny. As for Eastern Europe, there's a little more in the way of dry weather, but fairly cloudy skies, albeit dry, for Berlin.
I'm embarking on an epic adventure. From spectacular natural landscapes to the busiest cities in the world. Discovering ancient artifacts to meeting the people who love them and protect them. To understand how thousands of years of culture and tradition continue to shape modern China. Join me, Alistair Sook, for China's greatest treasures on BBC World News.
Double-side recovery right now!
In a world of complex global news stories, we'll sift through the information to bring you what matters most. And with reaction and reporting in real time,
our immigration laws are a laughingstock all over the world.
You'll know what's happening around the world as we do.
And that these new measures won't actually stop Venezuelans coming over, it will just make the migrant crisis worse.
Whatever the story, we'll piece it together. Join me, Ros Atkins, for Outside Source on BBC World News.
The police are here. They haven't been for the last 12 hours or so, but they are now here. This is the response many were waiting for.
The destruction of this medieval symbol of Paris has left the city under a pall of shock and smoke.
Hunger breeds desperation. It's entirely understandable when people have gone for days without food.
Celebrations here are about more than just this election. Mr Modi's BJP party secured an historic landslide victory.
It may have been designed to damage rather than sink, but either way, it has sparked huge international tension.
We break stories from more places than any other international news broadcaster. We are the leaders in global breaking news.
Talking Movies reports from the London Film Festival, highlights from the biggest film event in the UK. We hear from the stars who made it onto the red carpet. We also look at the festival's smaller, vibrant offerings. British pictures made on a shoestring. Join me, Tom Brooke, for Talking Movies on BBC World News.
I'm Geetha Gurumuthy, live at Westminster. Queen Elizabeth sets out the British government policy agenda in Parliament. But behind the pomp and pageantry, this year's Queen's speech feels like a sideshow to the main event of whether a Brexit deal will be agreed this week.
My government intends to work towards a new partnership with the European Union based on free trade and friendly cooperation.
I'm Lucy Hawkins here in the studio. Our other main headlines. Syria's government starts moving troops to the northern border to try to halt Turkey's offensive against the Kurds. And the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge head to Pakistan for the first visit by the royal family in 13 years.
Welcome to a wet, damp Westminster, which has just been the scene of the state opening of Parliament, the moment where the Queen, Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth, comes to Parliament from Buckingham Palace in a carriage procession and formally does a short speech announcing what the Prime Minister plans to try and put through in legislative terms through the building behind me. I went and just stood just down there and saw that moment of the Queen, looking stunning as always, of course, being brought in with all the horse guards surrounding her. But it does feel slightly surreal this year because, of course, the government here does not have a majority. It is very likely that we are facing an election, and how much of what we heard announced today will actually pass through this year, well, that is very uncertain too. Meanwhile, the big question still dominating politics here is Brexit. And the British and European teams are still negotiating. They are meeting today with efforts to try to reach a deal intensifying. Let's just have a listen now to what was announced in the state opening of Parliament ceremony. There was a reference, of course, to Brexit, but it all began with a formal procession, the Queen travelling from Buckingham Palace to Westminster by carriage. And Boris Johnson's administration is now making a series of promises here on domestic policies, but with a general election on the horizon, it isn't clear how much we will see of that. Let's hear what was said.
My government intends to work towards a new partnership with the European Union based on free trade and friendly cooperation. My ministers will work to implement new regimes for fisheries, agriculture and trade, seizing the opportunities that arise from leaving the European Union. An immigration bill ending free movement will lay the foundation for a fair, modern and global immigration system. My government remains committed to ensuring that resident European citizens who have built their lives in and contributed so much to the United Kingdom have the right to remain.
Well, let's get some reaction to what we've heard here in the last hour. I'm joined by three guests now. Bridget Fowler from the Hansard Society, Kevin Maguire from the Daily Mirror newspaper, and James Johnson, former pollster in number 10 Downing Street under Theresa May, of course. Let me just start with you, Bridget. In terms of what we saw here today, it is Britain does formality and pageantry like nobody else. And yet, people are criticising the fact that the Queen has effectively announced a list of promises from Boris Johnson that he might not deliver.
I think that's right. I mean, it's been well over 2 years since the last such state opening, and even on a grey day like today, it's quite a sight. But it doesn't actually change the politics of the situation. It changes some procedural things in Parliament, but it doesn't actually change the politics, which is that the government does not have a reliable majority in the House of Commons.
Kevin, your just quick response to what we saw. Some interesting moments seeing Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn walking rather awkwardly up to that ceremony. What did you...
Yeah, there's no warmth between the Prime Minister and the opposition leader, and they know they're going into the fight of their lives at the general election, which will be very, very soon. But behind the Disney pomp and ceremony and the fairy tale carriage and all that, effectively the Queen, the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, says was just reading out the Conservative Party election manifesto because, as we just heard, there's no way of getting any of those bills through Parliament because Boris Johnson's squandered what majority he had. He must be minus 42, I think, now, if there's in a 650-seat Parliament. So she's read it out, but she's really just reading out the Tories' battle plan for the next election.
And before we come to the details of Brexit exactly this week, James Johnson, you're a pollster expert. Boris Johnson is ahead in the polls in this country of the Labour leader by quite a margin, it seems. What do you make of what he announced? Because that is potentially a pre-election set of promises.
Well, firstly, Kevin and Bridget are absolutely right that everything today will have been based on the voters that the Conservatives need to win. And you can see that in what's been announced today. I think there were 6 bills on crime, there was immigration in there was the NHS, some issues around employment, cost of living as well. So they'll be thinking about exactly how they win those voters over. Yes, Boris Johnson and the Conservatives are ahead of the polls at the moment, but that's based on, when voters are asked that question, they're asked based on a general election taking place tomorrow. What we have to remember is that if Boris Johnson does not get a deal and isn't able to leave the European Union by 31st of October, that election is going to be happening in a very different scenario to now, so it's going to be very, very hard to predict.
And Kevin, just on terms of the Brexit talks, because that is absolutely critical now. Yep. There's an EU summit on Thursday. That means they've got to reach an agreement by Wednesday night. Is that possible?
It's very unlikely. I think they could see a way forward for the talks, and Parliament comes back on the Saturday, first sitting on a Saturday since 1982 in the Falklands War. And Boris Johnson said, look, it's do Brexit by October 31st or die. He's not going to do it. He doesn't want to die. So I'm going to have to swallow, I believe, an extension, assuming the other 27 countries agree, and try and get it sorted before the end of January. Whether you then have a general election at the end of November, early December, as Labour have said they would push, or whether they switch and decide we're going to wait until the deal or no deal is out the way and go into the spring, that we don't know. And there are just so many variables, and politics is so turbulent. Brexit absolutely dominates, but the concerns of people are, as James was mentioning, on law and order, the NHS, incomes, the economy and so on. They're all going to come into play in any election that comes along.
Richard, we heard the Queen say that talking about Brexit, of course, Boris Johnson's words, talking about free trade and friendly cooperation with European neighbours. What do you think is going to happen this week?
Oh, that's a $1,000 million question. I agree that it looks pretty unlikely that an actual legal text could possibly be prepared in time to be signed off on Thursday or Friday. That seems very unlikely.
So what happens then?
I think the issue is whether or not they can come up with some sort of statement or a document that gives enough hope that a deal is possible, that it provides some cover for the Prime Minister politically to say we've almost got a deal, or we have basically got a deal, but we're just crossing the T's and dotting the I's, and therefore it's a sort of technical extension. I think that might be the only way to do it, but political calculations will come in. Obviously, the Prime Minister might decide that he wants to just do a no deal and try and trigger an election on those grounds.
And how would he do that?
Well,
if it's up to him, if the opposition don't have a no confidence vote in him, if he wants to do it, he can put a bill through, can't he?
He could. There are various things he could try and do, but the immediate deadline is that if he hasn't got a deal through, and if the House of Commons has not approved no deal by Saturday, there is a legal obligation on him to write the letter, and my understanding is that if he didn't do that, some people would probably start legal proceedings next week.
So we end up back in court. James, what are you hearing about how much Conservative support there might be if Boris Johnson, let's say he does manage to get some sort of deal that he can put through the Commons on Saturday?
Well,
do you think there is enough support from the very arch Brexiteers?
So this is going to be the question. If it's a fully fledged agreed deal, then you could see a way in which he might be able to get it through, dependent on the DUP, dependent on others. But this sort of halfway house option that Bridget alluded to, where there's general agreement, but it's not quite there, and they might need an extension. That's going to be very difficult for some to swallow. You have to remember that Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party are poised, waiting with their video montages of Boris Johnson saying hundreds of times over the last 3 months, we're leaving on the 31st of October. So it's then going to come down to a really difficult political judgment, and I think there are different factions within Number 10 on this as well. There are the people from the Vote Leave camp who are very, very keen to get out by 31st of October, whatever happens, and then there are other members of Boris Johnson's team who are a little bit more conservative, a little bit more moderate. So there's going to be an almighty battle over that if that does become the outcome.
Finally, yes, Kevin, the opposition is split. That's also been part of the huge problem in politics here. Referendum or general election, what do you think?
Yeah, Theresa May 108 times said we'd be out on March the 29th, and that she didn't fulfil it. I'm sure Boris Johnson will try and play the term trick. But there is, in the House of Commons, there is this growing feeling about putting whatever is agreed, if it's agreed, to another referendum. But whether you can actually organise the votes and get people to do that is very difficult. And again, it's another unknown. There is no agreement on really any single way forward, which is why Brexit is such a mess.
Kevin Maguire, Bridget Fowler, James Johnson, thanks all for that. Just a flavour of where we're going. It looks like being a very, very turbulent few days. Probably the next couple of weeks as that October the 31st deadline, of course, looms. But October the 19th, Saturday, is another key date by which the government has got to technically ask for an extension if they have not reached a deal on Brexit. Lucy.
Peter, thank you so much. Do stay with us here on BBC World News. Still to come, Aaron's going to join us with the business news, including the impact being felt in Beijing as a result of the US-China trade war.
A lot of people who are living in the past think that the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition is a show where people have paintings of cats and dogs. But the Summer Exhibition is one of the most serious contemporary art exhibitions in the world.
I'm embarking on an
epic adventure to understand how thousands of years of culture and tradition continue to shape modern China.
We're in a time where people want to participate. On the most kind of basic level, I think it's important for theatre to keep itself relevant and engaging with the society around it. At its best, it's provocative.
Gordon buys and buys and buys and then buys a bit more.
It's an obsession that burns with an incandescent light and passion. That's one of the most beautiful objects I think I've ever touched.
I'm hooked on the incredible, elusive, surprising effects from just letting it go.
He's marshalling all those forces and creating these great operatic works.
Inspiring arts and culture on BBC World News.
We're not just here to show you these amazing places,
but to inspire you.
To leave your comfort zone behind.
I know they said I'm not going to feel the cold. I just want to get in now.
To experience different cultures, secret histories, tantalizing food, delicious, breathtaking landscapes,
and hidden gems.
So come and join us. It's time to plan your next adventure. Teams arrived. I guess off we go.
The Travel Show on BBC World News.
This week on The Travel Show,
I'll be hanging out with these guys.
Climbing jagged peaks and exploring remote festivals. Join me, Mike Corey, in Malaysia for The Travel Show on BBC World News.
Hello, welcome back to GMT. Let's join Aaron now, who has all the business news. And the Chinese are feeling there is, what's happening with the trade war, Aaron, with the US, the economy.
There's a little bit of optimism from these talks, a very limited deal. They're calling it phase one, but still not even signed off yet. So we'll wait and see, Luce. Hello there. Yeah, China's exports, or everything it ships out to the United States, actually shrank by nearly 22% for the month of September. That, of course, is after being hit by those heavier tariffs. The news certainly underscores the urgency for Beijing to resolve the trade dispute with Washington. Now, you may remember we talked about it on Friday. The US agreed to suspend its next tariff increase on Chinese imports. It's after the latest trade talks were being held in Washington. The US had been due to raise tariffs on some Chinese goods by up to 30%. That was actually supposed to kick in tomorrow. Yeah, Tuesday. Theo Leggett is our business correspondent who's been covering this. Theo, lovely to see you, my friend. So what we've got here, we've got what? China agreeing to buy more US agricultural stuff. And on the flip side, Washington saying, OK, we won't increase this next round of tariffs. That's about it. Very limited, right? And as I was just saying to Lucy, not even signed off yet.
I think, Aaron, you have to say that progress is progress. And for the moment, what we're not seeing is an escalation in trade tensions between China and the United States. That's kind of the important bit here. I mean, if you look at what's actually been agreed and, as you say, not officially signed off, China's agreed to buy more agricultural products from the United States to the value of $40 to $50 billion. Now, the US deficit to China is $400 billion. So when you look at the big picture there, it's not going to make a huge dent. Likewise, the delay to the increase in tariffs from 25% to 30% on some products, that's not going to make a huge difference either if you take a look at the massive amount of tariffs that are already in place. And against that, of course, there is the background of a slowing global economy. So what we're seeing here is a tentative step, a mini deal, but it's not the big breakthrough that the United States was looking for. It doesn't affect things like the protection of US intellectual property, forced technology transfer, which was at the heart of the United States case against China anyway. So it's really baby steps.
Yeah, baby steps. So yeah, you were just touching on it. There's not one agreement with Beijing for any of those structural points that you were just mentioning. So maybe some would suggest that the Trump administration, have they caved a little bit?
I don't think they've caved a little bit, but they've stepped back from escalation. And what the Trump administration will be wanting to see, I think, before this whole thing can be resolved, is some gesture, at least from China, to combat intellectual property theft and the transfer of technology. And those things at the moment haven't happened. So what many analysts are saying here is that this little mini agreement, it doesn't wash much. So you could see further escalation of tensions later on in the year if China doesn't concede more ground than it has done already.
OK, well, that we're going to have to wait and see. Short and sweet, but Theo, we appreciate your time. Theo Leggett joining us there. Let me just touch on some of the other stories making headline news. The initial public offering, or it's the stock market listing or debut of the state-owned oil producer Saudi Aramco will be announced very, very soon. That's according to the company's chairman. He was quoted as saying by Al Arabiya Television, Saudi Aramco's board could give its final approval, that is, to proceed with its mammoth share sale in the next few weeks. That we're going to have to wait and see. Hey, Facebook's Libra cryptocurrency has been dealt yet another major blow. A report for the world's biggest economies, the so-called G7 group of nations, says the plan must not go ahead until the company proves it's safe and secure. It comes just days after payment giants MasterCard and Visa pulled out of the project, citing regulatory uncertainty. The Japanese tech conglomerate SoftBank is reported to be in talks to take control of WeWork as the loss-making property group faces a cash crunch that, well, basically threatens its solvency. The proposed deal would give SoftBank more than a 50% stake in the company. SoftBank already owns around 30% of WeWork shares. Short and sweet from me, that's it. Follow me on Twitter. You can get me at BBC Aaron. Tweet me, I'll tweet you back. No talking business today. No. Parliament debating. Very important. Brexit.
See you tomorrow.
Biffed again. See you tomorrow.
Good to see you. Bye-bye. The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge will arrive in Pakistan on Monday for the first visit by the royal family for 13 years. The security situation has improved in the country, but a big military and police presence is expected. Secunda Kamani reports now on previous royal tours and what we can expect from this one.
Respecting the laws of Islam, the Queen donned a veil, took off her shoes and put on a pair of socks to pad gently round the mosque.
When Prince William arrives in Pakistan alongside his wife Kate, he'll be following in his family's footsteps. His grandmother, the Queen, visited in 1997.
Princess Diana's visit attracted media attention.
But it's his mother, Princess Diana, who's most fondly remembered here. Abida Hussain was a leading politician assigned to accompany Diana on her first visit in 1991.
There was a sort of magic which surrounded her. She was like a fairy tale princess. And women especially came out to see this fairy tale princess. And I'm confident that Prince William and Princess Kate will also receive a very enthusiastic reception in Pakistan.
Security will be tight throughout William and Kate's trip. But Pakistani authorities will be keen to showcase how much safer the country has become over the past few years. And the visit has a special significance for the UK, given its large Pakistani diaspora. The two countries might enjoy a close relationship, but it's one that's ultimately rooted in Britain's history as a colonial power. And whilst you can find some who express a degree of nostalgia about that era, many others remember the brutal human rights abuses. At this bazaar in the northern city of Peshawar in April 1930, pro-independence demonstrators were gunned down by the British Army. Local historians say hundreds died. Does it look quite similar to how it used to look in 1930s?
Yes, it is almost 98%.
Iqbal's grandfather ran a shop here at the time. He witnessed the massacre and was arrested and tortured for helping the protesters.
There were bodies all over the bazaar. The street was full of blood. He used to say it affected him very badly, seeing so much bloodshed. The British should definitely apologize for what happened. Those who died can't return, but we are their families. At least they should express their sympathy and apologize.
For others, the priorities are different. They hope this royal visit could help boost Pakistan's global image.
People do not really visit Pakistan due to terrorism and all these things. But I guess it's good that they are coming. It will change our country's image in a very good way.
There are reminders of British rule strewn across Pakistan. But for many in both countries, it's more convenient to focus on the future rather than the past. Secunda Kamani, BBC News.
And we'll be keeping a Across the World tour for you all this week. But we wanted to end this edition of GMT with something truly inspirational. Over the weekend, 3 extraordinary female athletes redefined what the human body is capable of. You'll recognise this superstar gymnast Simone Biles. She won a record-breaking 25th medal at the World Championships in Stuttgart, and that makes her the championship's most decorated gymnast of all time. Coco Gauff, so much more to come from her, but she's only 15, a tennis prodigy, shot to prominence with her performances at Wimbledon, you'll remember, over the summer. Well, on Sunday, the teenager claimed victory at the Linz Open final in Austria. That makes her the youngest player to win a WTA title in 15 years. Just an incredible feat. And finally, Kenya's Bridget Kosgei dominated the Chicago Marathon, shattering the women's world marathon record in the process. She ran the course in a staggering 2 hours and 14 minutes. Now, we had to put that in perspective for you. Just listen to this. That is the equivalent of running the 100 metres in just 19 seconds, 422 times in a row. Take a minute to think about that and how long it might take you to run the 100 metres. I've done the maths. Good to have you with us. Bye-bye.
Most of the major motor manufacturers are guaranteeing the life of the batteries in their new EVs for 8 years or 100,000 miles. Some researchers suspect the lithium-ion batteries used in electric vehicles could last much longer than that, though.
Ultimately, we are going to have to deal with the batteries at the end of their useful life. Not only will we have to deal with the batteries as a waste problem, the batteries themselves contain as many times as we can.
The UK's government has tasked the Faraday Institution, an independent national battery research institute, with accelerating EV growth through innovations in battery technology. Birmingham University is leading a project on battery recycling in partnership with Faraday. Dr. Paul Anderson is part of the team conducting this research.
So what we have here is an example of a battery pack that we've stripped down. And this is a Mark 1 Nissan Leaf. At the moment, based on current technologies, the recovery of materials from the batteries is comparable in terms of its environmental impact to primary mining. There's every reason to think that we can actually improve and make these processes a lot more efficient. And that's important because the whole point, of course, of the electric revolution is to stop CO2 emissions.
At the moment, there are only a few places in the world which are able to recycle EV lithium-ion batteries. Umicore in Belgium has the capability to recycle batteries from devices like laptops and mobile phones. It's added EV batteries to its repertoire of recyclables.
It's basically a combination of hydro and pyrometallurgy. It's a unique in-house built process, and actually at the end of the process we're able to refine cobalt, nickel, lithium and copper, and also residue of rare earth elements. And these metals, they can infinitely be recycled, they don't lose any of their qualities, and they can easily be reused in new applications.
While recycling of EV batteries is possible, there are a couple of problems. The batteries themselves aren't always easy to disassemble. And so far, there isn't a standardised method of recycling.
There's still the first generation of EVs is still on the road, and so there was no real need for a big recycling process. But we have a capacity of 7,000 tons, and we are able to upscale when the market will be ready. We expect it to be by 2025, something like that.
Recycling old electric car batteries might seem like the most obvious thing to do with them, but just because their days out on the open road might be over, that doesn't mean that the batteries themselves can't still be useful. Old Nissan Leaf batteries are helping to power parts of this stadium in Amsterdam. The same kind of technology could be used to power homes or even
volt or 80% of their capacity. Now that's quite important if you're actually trying to drive a car, but they're still perfectly good for perhaps as many years again, another 10 years in other energy storage applications.
Whether it's recycling or reuse, all of these technologies could help make motoring considerably more environmentally friendly.
For the times of the full-length Click this weekend, check out our website bbc.com/click.
The world needs to know Brazil by Brazil. One of the main oil-producing countries, Brazil dominates the exploration in deep waters and offers a number of opportunities in this field. The country presents the world's biggest infrastructure concession program, with projects amounting to over $50 billion. The goal is to diversify the transportation network, expanding and modernizing railways, waterways, ports, and airports. Meet a new Brazil, full of opportunities. Meet Brazil by Brazil.
Hello there. We've seen a winter storm that's brought some issues across the northern plains and in parts of North Dakota. There's been over 30 inches of snow, but that storm system, this circulation here on the satellite picture, is moving its way across the Great Lakes and is starting to ease. At the same time, we've still got a stationary front that's moving its way across parts of Texas, and it's bringing some heavy rain, and it will enhance some heavier rainfall over the next few days. As for South America, we've got some wet weather across northern Argentina. That's bringing a change of wind direction and a dramatic change to the feel of the weather, with temperatures at least half the values of where they were just a few days ago. Into Europe now, we've got weather fronts moving their way from west to east, so bringing bands of rain, some of it heavy at times, some snow across the Alps, a cooler feel into Scandinavia, a brief lull before another system moves in from the Atlantic. We'll see some wet weather close to the equator continuing, the weather fronts moving their way through Europe, perhaps just affecting northern parts of the African coastline from time to time, again sweeping west to east. The Middle East, though, is fairly straightforward. It's a quiet story, not that much in the way of cloud around, a light breeze as well, a pleasant feel to things with temperatures peaking into the mid-30s. And the monsoon rain still very much a feature, a slow withdrawal at the moment, but we're seeing some rain down to the south, the best of the drier weather the further north and west you are. It's a quieter story across much of Asia as Hagibis is now long gone. There will be some outbreaks of rain towards the east of Japan, close to Tokyo, but nowhere near as heavy or as extensive as obviously it has been. A quieter spell through China, some showers down into Malaysia and Indonesia. A quiet spell of weather across Australia as well at the moment, with heat building from the interior, starting to drift its way steadily east. But we've got some wet and windy weather moving its way through both the north and the South Island of New Zealand. Take care.
With the UK Parliament in crisis and the Brexit deadline approaching, will the Prime Minister make a deal? Will he ask for an extension? Will there be a general election? See the headlines as they happen, with breaking news alerts on our app. And get the full story with bbc.com/Brexit. Follow the latest on Britain's exit from the EU with BBC News.
This is Impact, bringing you all the day's top stories, and later in the programme, more news in depth. I'm Celia Hatton. Help for the Kurds in northern Syria. President Assad's troops move into new positions in the northeast of the country. So will the plan brokered by Russia limit Turkey's push into northern Syria? We'll have the latest live. I'm Philippa Thomas, live at Westminster, where Queen Elizabeth, arriving in her golden coach, has officially opened a new session of Parliament.
In a ceremony full of the traditional pomp and pageantry, she put Brexit firmly at the top of the agenda.
My government's priority has always been to secure the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union on the 31st of October.
Ready?
And legendary director Martin Scorsese talks about how he's embraced new technology for his latest film, The Irishman. That's all coming up on Impact. Welcome to the programme. We're live for the next 45 minutes and you can give me your views at Celia Hatton. You know the saying, my enemy's enemy is my friend. The Kurds in northern Syria, abandoned by the United States and facing an offensive by Turkish forces, have made a deal with President Assad. They've allowed Syrian government troops into the northeast of the country, hoping the move will protect them against the Turks. These pictures are of Syrian government forces gathering in Tel Tamer. They're already moving into key locations near the Turkish border. The deal has been brokered by Russia, which is an ally of Syria's President Assad. The Kurds hope the Syrian army will deploy along the entire length of the Turkish border as part of the agreement, although little is known about what exactly Damascus has committed to. From the Kurds' point of view, help is desperately needed. Turkey has made gains in two key border towns, Ras Al Ain and Tel Abyad, over the weekend. Dozens of civilians and fighters have been killed on both sides. Aline McBool is close to the area where the Kurds made the deal.
Well, the area you can see behind me is currently under Syrian Kurdish control, but the way things are looking in the coming days or hours even, who knows, this is going to revert to Syrian regime control, and that is just one of the tumultuous events that people here have found it so difficult to grapple with. Remember, just over a week ago, the White House, in effect, endorsed a Turkish invasion plan. Since then, we've seen an assault from Turkey. We've seen many Kurdish deaths. We've seen destabilization. We've seen Islamic State group fighters escape when the facilities that were holding them were shelled. And now, in this extraordinary turn of events, we've seen the Kurdish administration that has been in control of some territory since the end of 2011. Small pockets that expanded to cover around a quarter of the country. They have now said, because the US troops are leaving, they want the Syrian regime to come in, fill the void, and take on the fight against Turkish forces. And Syrian Kurds have been left with just another thing. After having sacrificed so much in the fight against the Islamic State group, they have now been left reeling and unable to predict what chaos will be brought on them tomorrow.
Well, President Trump has faced a lot of criticism, including from fellow Republicans, for pulling out of Syria. And true to form, he's been tweeting about it. Referring to the escape of hundreds of Islamic State prisoners from a Kurdish camp, he said, Kurds may be releasing some to get us involved, easily recaptured by Turkey or European nations from where many came, but they should move quickly. Big sanctions on Turkey coming. Do people really think we should go to war with NATO member Turkey? Never-ending wars will end. Well, Martin Patience is in Ceylan Pinar on Turkey's border with Syria. Martin, alliances have changed in the past 24 hours, but how have things changed on the ground?
I mean, it's been extraordinary. America's stunning withdrawal yesterday has completely scrambled northeastern Syria and completely changed the dynamics of this conflict. As you were saying, Celia, the Kurds are now aligned not to the Americans but to the Syrian regime. And what we've seen is pictures of Syrian troops pushing up to the Turkish border. Now, the Kurdish claim is that Syrian troops will fan across the Turkish border. I think the Syrian army has been hollowed out during 8 years of war, so there is a propaganda war going on, but certainly the Kurds felt they had no choice, and now if Turkey attacks Kurdish forces, it will also be attacking the Syrian regime, and let's not forget that they're backed by Russia and Iran, so it complicates the battlefield, but from the Kurdish point of view, it will offer them a degree of security for now, although a top Kurdish commander said that compromising with the Syrian government had been very painful indeed.
You said it complicates the battlefield. Do you think this new alliance between the Kurds and the Syrian forces might affect Turkey's strategy?
Yeah, I think it will, because Turkey, okay, it can push in, and we're still seeing this offensive going on, but how far will it push? And I think it will now have to reassess its options, because if it pushes too deep, potentially it's attacking Syrian forces who are supported by Russia and Iran, and that obviously will have to be factored in to any of its plans, because the danger always is in Syria that, as horrible as the war has been in this country for 8 years, that potentially it could trigger something far worse. So this is a dangerous moment from Syria. The American withdrawal has created a vacuum. Powers are rushing to fill it. But it's also a dangerous moment for the Middle East as well.
Okay, thank you to Martin Patience speaking to us from Syria. Now, a little later in the programme, we're going to be speaking to our correspondent in Moscow about Russia's role in the events unfolding between Turkey and Syria. Now, it's an event famous for its pageantry, the state opening of the British Parliament, where Queen Elizabeth, arriving in her golden carriage, reads out the government's programme. A central element of that is, of course, Brexit, which the ruling Conservatives insist will happen in a little over a fortnight's time. Well, talks with the European Union on a Brexit deal, however, are delicately poised. Now let's go to Westminster. Philippa Thomas is there for us.
Celia, thank you very much. Well, in her speech, Queen Elizabeth, speaking on behalf of the government, of course, said the UK's exit from the European Union would not diminish its influence on the global stage.
As the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, my government will ensure that it continues to play a leading role in global affairs, defending its interests and promoting its values. My government will be at the forefront of efforts to solve the most complex international security issues. It will champion global free trade and work alongside international partners to solve the most pressing global challenges.
About the most pressing challenges facing Boris Johnson's government, but I also want to give you a flavour of the agenda as a whole, which covered health, education, fighting crime, the environment. There was a lot in there that Boris Johnson would clearly love to be able to get on with. Let me bring in my guest, Bronwyn Maddox, the director of the Institute for Government. What struck you about the substance of the speech?
I thought it was very much in the character of Boris Johnson. A lot of the themes that we've heard him talking about. So yes, it absolutely kicked off with Brexit. That was the first thing that the Queen said. There was a lot about the environment, and this made it seem, an election campaigning package, if you like, but something. Yes, but it was very deliberate that was in there. Took up almost more space than health and education, those traditional things. All right, we heard quite a bit about them at the party conferences. Obviously, a lot about security, but also about international security as well, saying that Britain wanted to retain its place in the world. So it was more rounded, perhaps, than I had expected. I had thought there would be an awful lot of hammering on lots of money for public services, and that about it.
Usually when there's a Queen's speech, it's on behalf of a government with a majority. Now, Boris Johnson is well short of a majority, so is this, as I heard one opposition MP say immediately afterwards, just a fantasy speech?
Well, not entirely. It is, first place, a very good political opportunity for him to set out what he wants to do. Can he get it through? Very likely not, unless lots of MPs, not formally part of his party, decided to vote for it. But within there is Brexit legislation. He said, look, I need to get through some Brexit bills, including, if he gets a deal with the European Union, a withdrawal agreement bill. And this is really where the attention is. The rest of it is positioning, but it doesn't mean an awful lot until we've got a way ahead on Brexit.
Well, let's get back from the positioning to the core, because we do want to know what's happening with those negotiations between the UK and its EU partners. And key to that, of course, is what Dublin says, because so much hangs on arrangements on the island of Ireland. So the Irish Foreign Minister Simon Coveney has been speaking about this. Let's have a little listen to his cautious optimism.
On Brexit, the less we say now, the better. We need to give
time and space to Michel Barnier and his task force and the British negotiating team. I think it's pretty clear what we're trying to do. But there are pretty detailed technical discussions now, and I think we need to give the time and space for that to happen. Hopefully we can make progress today on those.
Well, talk from the Irish there about the hope of progress. How would you rate the likelihood of a deal?
Well, we've had just in the past week or so the mood going up, then dramatically down, now up again, and all we have to guide us really is the mood and the comments of people coming out of those talks. But I think you can see why the Prime Minister has every incentive to get a deal. It's his best way, in my view, of retaining control of the process that's going on. And there does seem to be some movement, both on all sides, on the European Union side, on the Democratic Unionist Party side, and with the government itself, just about these very complicated questions about how to treat customs arrangements around Northern Ireland.
Yeah, movement, which is not to be discounted, that really matters. Movement that will matter as well will be here at Parliament, because the deal would have to go through Westminster.
Yes, and he will need about 30 MPs to switch positions from the last time they voted in March. Not entirely impossible, particularly if the DUP was prepared to move. All right, that's 10. Whether he then got some more Conservatives, that would rely on the same 5 or so Labour MPs who voted for the deal last time, or for a similar deal last time, voting in the same way. Not impossible, but the numbers are tight. And of course, it depends on getting the deal in the first place with the European Union.
So much is contingent. Bronwyn Maddox, thank you very much so. And Celia, we will keep you posted on what's happening here at Westminster, also what we hear about the negotiations in Brussels. Debate on the Queen's speech should begin in just over an hour's time, and we'll also be bringing you the speeches. We'll be listening to what Boris Johnson and the opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn have to say. But for now, back to you.
Philippa, thank you. We'll keep an eye on that. Well, to Spain, where the Supreme Court has handed out lengthy prison terms to 9 Catalan separatist politicians for their role in the region's failed attempt to declare independence in 2017. Catalonia's leader at the time, Carles Puigdemont, who's in self-imposed exile, has branded the sentences an outrage. And some breaking news for you now. In the last few minutes, a European arrest warrant has been issued for Mr. Puigdemont. In July 2018, the Spanish court dropped a warrant after Germany refused to extradite him. Protests are expected in the Catalonia region in response to the convictions. Guy Hedgeko has more from Madrid.
We were expecting some fairly stiff jail sentences. We didn't know exactly how long. But these seem to have borne that out. This is a hugely anticipated verdict. It has caused a political crisis, these tensions between Madrid and Catalonia. And today we've seen this jail sentence for Oriol Junqueras, the former vice president of Catalonia. He's facing a 13-year jail sentence for sedition. That's the highest jail sentence that's been handed out, but 8 of his former colleagues have also been given quite stiff jail sentences, also for sedition. So I think the independence movement was expecting stiff sanctions, but these are very much on the higher end of what they're expecting, I think.
Well, the Barcelona Football Club issued a statement in support of the jailed leaders. It said the resolution of the conflict in Catalonia must come exclusively from political dialogue. It continued, the club asks all political leaders to lead a process of dialogue and negotiation to resolve this conflict, which should allow for the release of convicted civic and political leaders. FC Barcelona also expresses all its support and solidarity to the families of those who are deprived of their freedom. Well, the government of Ecuador has agreed to reinstate fuel subsidies after 12 days of mass protests by indigenous people that brought the country to a standstill. The reversal, which prompted indigenous leaders to pledge an end to their demonstrations, prompted mass celebrations erupted in the capital of Quito. The agreement was reached at talks brokered by the United Nations and the Catholic Church. President Lenin Moreno said in the agreement was a solution for peace and for Ecuador. Protests have been held in the U.S. after a black woman was shot dead by police through her own bedroom window. 28-year-old Atiana Jefferson had been at home in Fort Worth, Texas, with her 8-year-old nephew. A neighbor had called police, worried that her front door was open at night. Her shooting was recorded on the officer's body camera. You may find what we're about to show upsetting. It shows an officer who was white shooting within seconds of seeing her. It does not appear to show him identifying himself as a police officer.
Put your hands up! Show me your hands!
And that video coming to us from Texas. Well, stay with us on Impact, still to come. More than 100,000 people are taking part in search and rescue operations after Typhoon Hagibis hit Japan on Saturday.
Sorry.
Think this is funny? Is this a joke to you?
It's so awful, isn't it?
Are you having any negative thoughts?
There are many who prey on the innocent. I'm sure your kind would agree. If I didn't know better, I'd say you were making a threat. Well, do you? Do I what? No better.
This is Impact on BBC World News. A reminder of our top story this hour. Kurdish forces in northeastern Syria have allowed government forces of President Assad into their region to counter the Turkish offensive. Well, let's stay with that story. One of the key parties in the Syrian conflict is Russia. And our Moscow correspondent Steve Rosenberg joins me now. Steve, some are saying that Moscow is the big winner in the latest shift of alliances in Syria. Is this true?
I think so. I think Russia gains a lot from the current situation. Russia gains because President Assad gains. He gains territory. The fact that the Syrian army has moved into northeastern Syria, that helps President Assad achieve what he said he wanted to achieve, to reclaim every inch of Syrian territory. And who is President Assad's biggest backer? It is Russia. But there's another reason, I think, why Russia comes out of this well, and that is because America comes out of this looking very bad indeed. In abandoning the Kurds, America's reputation as a reliable and a trustworthy partner has been, well, seriously damaged. I mean, some may say torn to shreds. And that allows Russia to move in and say, not only to the Kurds, but to all the players in the Middle East region, look, everyone, Russia is the key power broker here. Russia is the only one you can trust. So deal with Russia, forget America. So I think there's the reputational damage to America that is in Russia's interest too.
Steve, how do you think then the Russian President Vladimir Putin will continue to make use of this situation now that he is the key power broker in the region?
Well, what President Putin's spokesman said a short while ago was this. He said that actions that hinder a political situation in Syria and provoke tension are categorically undesirable. That stops short of saying, Turkey, lay down your weapons. The Russians certainly aren't saying that because, as I've said, I think the Russians have a lot to gain. But certainly Moscow will not want conflict to continue. The Russians want a diplomatic solution to this. Russia's militaries have been involved in Syria for more than 4 years now, and the Russians are counting on a diplomatic process to bring an end to this conflict.
Okay, thank you, Steve. That was Steve Rosenberg speaking to us from Moscow. Tens of thousands of rescuers have been deployed across Japan after the worst storm to hit the country in decades. So far, 43 people are reported to have died and another 16 are missing, with hundreds injured. Katie Silver reports.
Wading through muddy, waist-high water,
Rescuers in Nagano search for missing people. With gusts of up to 140 miles per hour, Typhoon Hagibis hit Japan's main island of Honshu on Saturday, leaving vast sections of towns in central and eastern Japan underwater.
When I came here yesterday, the water level here was above a metre, and this place was like a sea. I work in this area and thought this area wouldn't be able to function for a while.
The search and rescue efforts are extensive, with some donning goggles and snorkels to search for survivors in the Chikama River. A fleet of 100 military helicopters has been deployed to airlift people from their homes. In one tragic instance, a 77-year-old woman died after falling to the ground when she was accidentally dropped during an airlift. The damage has spread across 8 prefectures. Tokyo took a direct hit, but survived pretty much unscathed. Nagano, on the other hand, is the hardest hit, with the economic damage impossible to calculate. These bullet trains on the outskirts of the city, each one costing $29 million. 92,000 homes remain without power, and tens of thousands of people have been evacuated. This farmer has spent a number of nights in a nearby evacuation centre.
All 4 of my family are safe, but the cars and the farm machines are all ruined.
With further rain forecast, there is an ongoing fear of mudslides in the coming days. Katie Silver, BBC News.
Well, he's one of the most acclaimed directors of all time, with films including Taxi Drivers, Goodfellas and Raging Bull. Martin Scorsese's latest release, The Irishman, is about organised crime in post-war America. Our arts editor, Will Gompertz, has been speaking to him about it and about the cutting-edge technique he used to turn the clock back on his actors.
Management can only fire a driver on very specific charges. So, you ever show up late? No. Drink on the job? No. You ever hit anybody?
On a job?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
It's about power. It's about power, love, betrayal, and then ultimately the price you pay for the life you lead.
I'm here to defend you, right?
Right.
We could not get any financing from the Hollywood studios.
What do you want to know? You want to know if I did it or not?
Nobody was interested in making a film with me and Bob anymore. I just don't think they thought the audience was there.
The biggest theme going through the whole thing is, of course, it's about old age.
Old age.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's about the aging process and looking back on a life.
Yes, the aging process, ultimately, without scaring an audience saying, we want to go see a film about old age.
The way around that problem was to go high-tech and digitally de-age by several decades. The 3 septuagenarian male leads, Al Pacino, Joe Pesci and Robert De Niro. Are you happy with the de-aging?
Yes. We had started out one way. We ended up redoing shots that we did originally in the first week. By the 6 months later, we redid those shots because the technology was better.
The issue, I thought, with it wasn't the facial expressions so much, but the bodies. So Bob De Niro, a 70-something-year-old man, de-aged around his face, but his body is still a 70-year-old man, and it moves like a 70-something-year-old man.
At times, probably. Yeah, at times.
You make him climb over some rocks to chuck away a gun.
Oh, well, that was, it was early in the morning. I mean, give him a little leeway.
Hello? Is that Frank? Yes. Hiya, Frank. This is Jimmy Hoffa.
Do you like the idea of more and more technology coming in?
Anything new, as long as it doesn't take away the heart and the soul of the picture, the human element, that's the key.
But you wouldn't go all the way and make a comic book movie?
I don't know how to do that. I'm also not, I didn't even know that. It's so interesting. Why make it? It's really more of a theme park ride. It's not cinema, really.
It's going to happen. Either way, he's going.
That shouldn't take away the value and the power of true cinema, real films.
For all its digital de-aging, there is something old school about The Irishman. It's a 3.5-hour mob movie spanning half a century, not backed by Hollywood mind, but by a streaming giant, stepping in where the traditional studios fear to tread.
It's what it is.
What it is.
Will Gompertz, BBC News.
We'll have to go see that. Well, stay with us here on Impact. We'll have more on our top story. Syrian troops moving north to halt the Turkish incursion there. They're helping the Kurds after a deal was done between the enemies. And you can get in touch with me and the team on Twitter. I'm at Celia Hatton. Stay with us.
Hello there. More of an autumnal flavour now starting to evolve across Europe. It stays pretty unsettled over the next few days. You can see one weather system waiting in the wings, another one pushing in, and that will bring some rain as well. Sandwiched in between the two frontal systems, there will be drier, brighter interludes. You can see on Tuesday across much of Eastern Europe, it's a relatively quiet story, but that wet weather moving out of France, Germany, into the Alps as well. So the Mediterranean continues to stay fine and settled with temperatures into the high 20s for one or two spots. There will be a good deal of dry weather into the Balkans, heavy rain across northern Italy, snow to the Alps, and then some showers into France. And it has been a little more unsettled into Spain and Portugal with more wet weather waiting in the wings. It's rather cool as well into Scandinavia and breezy with it. And those temperatures are obviously just going to get a little more subdued as we go through the week. So this is the story then. Tuesday into Wednesday, the next system pushes in. Much of the Mediterranean stays fine and settled with those temperatures still peaking in the mid to high 20s in some spots. So the city forecast for the next few days, London and Paris keeps that autumnal flavour and temperatures easing down a little. Madrid and Rome dry, settled and sunny. As for Eastern Europe, there's a little more in the way of dry weather, but fairly cloudy skies, albeit dry for Berlin.
Talking business promo take one, market, action.
In a forward-planning, paradigm-shifting world where high-net-worth individuals leverage best business practice with binary answers, why not synergize with the Talking Business Tiger team, whose core competency is thinking outside the box and drilling down to get the answer? Well, oh, mate, it's a bit boring. It's not really me. Hey, how about this? If you want a business show that's fun, informative, and without all that jargon, then join me, Talking Business with Aaron Hesselhurst, weekdays on BBC World News. There you go. Job done, right? Hey, who wants a cup of tea?
We're doing a trail. What is Brexit cast?
I still don't know.
I thought we were just doing a podcast.
Yeah,
Not anymore. Okay, so what about you say, what's Brexit cast? And I say, well, I'm in Westminster. I say, well, I'm in Brussels.
We're pretty good at getting the insider gossip.
We'll tell you everything you need to know.
I think that'd be obvious from that, wouldn't it?
Well, let's try one and then see how long it is.
Okay.
What is Brexit cast then?
Oh, I was looking at the camera, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Brexit cast on BBC World News.
Across the globe, people have come to rely on an array of products, from bicycles to whiskey, spices to semiconductors.
The phone has made my job very easy.
This series looks at the people, systems and networks that go into making and bringing them to market.
We're spreading the knowledge and the technology across the globe.
Made on Earth on BBC World News.
Talking Movies reports from the London Film Festival, highlights from the biggest film event in the UK. We hear from the stars who made it onto the red carpet. We also look at the festival's smaller, vibrant offerings, British pictures made on a shoestring. Join me, Tom Brooke, for Talking Movies on BBC World News.
Hello, this is Impact, bringing you all the day's top stories, and later in the programme, more news in depth. I'm Celia Hatton. Well, help for the Kurds in northern Syria. President Assad's troops move into new positions in the northeast of the country. And the Queen has set out measures the British government wants to introduce after Brexit at the state opening of Parliament.
My government's priority has always been to secure the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union on the 31st of October.
Welcome to the programme. You can give me your views at Celia Hatton. Well, you know the saying, my enemy's enemy is my friend. The Kurds in northern Syria, abandoned by the United States and facing an offensive by Turkish forces, have made a deal with President Assad. They've allowed Syrian government troops into the northeast of the country. They're hoping the move will protect them against the Turks. These pictures are of Syrian government forces gathering in Tel Tamer. They're already moving into key locations near the Turkish border. The deal has been brokered by Russia, which is an ally of Syria's President Assad. The Kurds hope the Syrian army will deploy along the entire length of the Turkish border as part of the agreement, although little's known about what exactly Damascus has committed to. Meanwhile, areas under the control of the Turkish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, until recently a US ally in the area, have come under heavy bombardment from the Turkish military over the weekend. Turkey is making gains in two key border towns, Ras Al Ain and Tel Abyad. Dozens of civilians and fighters have been killed on both sides. Well, Hannah Lucinda Smith is the author of Erdogan Rising, the battle for the soul of Turkey, and she also writes for The Times. Hannah, some might be surprised to see the speed at which Turkey has pushed into Syria. Do you think this shows how long Erdogan has been waiting for this moment?
Well, he's certainly been rhetorically pushing for it for a long time. I mean, the talk about a proposed safe zone isn't anything new, and in fact, he'd been talking with the US about setting up joint patrols in the area all this summer. What the Kurds claim is that Turkey used some of those joint patrols to actually scope out what was happening on the Syrian side of the border, scope out the Kurdish positions, and also under the terms of those joint patrols that were set up in August, the Kurds removed some of their barricades. So these are all things that are likely to have eased the Turkish advance into that territory so far.
Mr. Erdogan has really pushed back against European criticisms of Turkey's move into Syria. But do you think privately those criticisms might hold him back at all?
I don't think so. I mean, I think Erdogan's concern is how this plays with the domestic audience. So, I mean, we have to remember whenever we look at Erdogan's actions, especially over the past 5 years, he has a tendency to use foreign policy and foreign actions for domestic ends. Now, this operation in Syria, obviously has drawn huge international criticism from all of Turkey's allies, pretty much. I mean, I think there's only Qatar, Somalia, and Pakistan who supported the operation. Even Northern Cyprus was, the president of Northern Cyprus was criticising over the weekend. But domestically, it plays incredibly well for two reasons. Firstly, the Kurdish militias in Syria, the YPG, are linked both ideologically and through their leadership to the PKK in Turkey. It's a Turkish Kurdish militia which has been fighting an insurgency in eastern Turkey since the 1980s. That's a war that's claimed tens of thousands of lives. And, any kind of operation against a group linked with the PKK plays really well with a Turkish audience across the board. And you can see that with the kind of reactions that we've seen from not only Erdogan supporters and not only from the Nationalist Party, but also from Erdogan's opponents, almost blanket apart from the Kurdish party in Turkey. And secondly, Erdogan's other rationale that he's touting domestically for starting this operation is to resettle some of the 3.6 million Syrian refugees that Turkey is housing in this safe zone once it's secured. Now, Erdogan realises very well that increasingly Turkish people are getting quite frustrated with the length of time that Turkey's been hosting refugees. They're starting to ask, well, are they going to be here for the long term? How are they going to be integrated? And will they be going back at some point? And this is another thing that Erdogan knows plays really, really well with his home audience.
So are there any limits then to Turkey's ambitions in Syria?
Well, what Turkey says it wants to do is to create this safe zone 300 miles along the border, along the eastern end of the Turkey-Syria border and 20 miles deep into Syria. Now, that's a huge area. I mean, Turkish forces and allied Syrian rebel groups are already controlling some areas inside Syria, but this new area is more than double the size of what they already control. It's going to be a huge commitment in terms of manpower. And of course, now they have not only the Kurds fighting back, but also Syrian regime forces, President Assad's forces, coming to the front lines. So, I think this is a far greater reach than anything Erdogan has tried to do in Syria before. And he could very well end up getting sucked into the Syrian quagmire for a long time to come here.
Okay, that was Hannah. Thank you, Hannah. That was Hannah Lucinda Smith speaking to us from Istanbul. Now, also in Syria, a Kurdish politician has been killed. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says Hevrin Khalaf was killed by gunmen on the side of a road in the Syrian town of Tel Abyad. She was the co-leader of the Future Syria Party. Kurdish groups are blaming Turkish-backed militia for the killing. Well, Onur Erem is from our Turkish service, and he's been looking into this story for us. What can you tell us about Ms. Khalaf? Who was she?
She was a politician, 35 years old, and working in northern Syria, and she was the leader of the Future Syria Party. And as a young politician, she was found as a charismatic leader in the party.
And she was young. She was just 35,
yes,
wasn't she? Now, we're hearing different stories about how she died. What are you hearing?
There are different reports. As you said, some say she was killed by militia, but also Syrian Democratic Forces and the parliament member from the government party in Turkey. They told that her convoy was hit by an airstrike. This was also news in the pro-government media in Turkey, that she was killed by a airstrike operation. So there are conflicting reports, and we don't know actually how she was killed.
And what's been the reaction to her death? I mean, it's quite a gruesome story that she was pulled out of her car, she was killed, her driver was killed. I hear that there's this big social media reaction.
Yes, people were mourning on social media, especially the Kurdish social media users. And there has been some diplomatic reaction as well. The former US envoy to the coalition against ISIS, Brett McGurk, he told that this killing would constitute a war crime.
Okay, thank you very much. That was Onur Erem speaking to us from BBC Turkish. Thank you. Well, let's get more on events here in London and the state opening of Parliament. Queen Elizabeth has laid out the range of policies the British government wants to follow after the UK leaves the European Union. The Queen's speech, read out on behalf of the government, contained plans for a new immigration bill and measures intended to ensure financial stability after Brexit. The Queen said the administration's priority is to secure Britain's withdrawal from the EU by the 31st of October. Well, Philippa Thomas is outside the Houses of Parliament.
Well, here at Westminster, we're in the somewhat strange situation where we've had an enormous ceremony, a great deal of pageantry, everything that goes with the state opening of Parliament. But of course, everybody is thinking about Brexit and the negotiations that are still going on between all the different players there. I want to bring you some insight now from Helen Thomas, who runs a political risk consultancy. But Helen, you were also an advisor to George Osborne, former Chancellor of the Exchequer. You know how things work at the heart of government. First, do you sense it's been somewhat surreal today?
Absolutely surreal, as you say. We've had this huge ceremony, but of course it's one where it will be a real challenge for the government to even pass what they want to pass. And of course, Brexit is really the dominating topic of the day, of the years to come. I mean, that's going to shape our economy just as much as all of these bills that have been announced today.
So in terms of government strategy, what do you think is in the heads of Boris Johnson and his advisor Dominic Cummings as they look at the 2 weeks ahead?
Absolutely key 2 weeks, of course, here, because, Boris Johnson has made this continued commitment. We will leave 31st of October, come what may. And of course, we have this piece of legislation that if there is no deal by the 19th, this Saturday, he'll be compelled to write an extension letter, which he's always said he won't. To be quite honest, it looks like there is a deliberate, huge clash on the agenda. We know that the government want to fight this as the people versus the establishment when it comes to an election. And so this is like almost their World Cup final to try and do that battle.
So they have been setting up, you could say, for a long time, for weeks, if not months, this battle where Boris Johnson can say, I represent the popular will. And yet he has been saying in the last few days, I'm really pushing everything I can to try to get a deal with Brussels.
Yes, I think he has to be seen to be doing that. I think to a degree he would like to do that as well. But it is all a bit of the theatre that, you know, he took over and initially looked very much like he was on the no-deal side. Now it looks like very much he wants to get a deal. I think there's a lot of playing here in how it looks in terms of where he actually wants to get to at the end. And the key point for the Conservative Party is another extension is no longer costless. You know, you've seen the plunge in the polls. Both Labour and Conservative lost a lot of ground after the last extension. So it can't be overemphasised just how existential it is. The Conservative Party need to get Brexit done.
When you said he needs to be seen to look for a deal, I do sense some scepticism.
I think, you know, look, we all have to appreciate that, I always say, look, I advise businesses and I say business is about what works, politics is about what sells. And it is all about the narrative. And of course the entire referendum was encapsulated by this concept of take back control. And I think, yes, there is a narrative that needs to be set here, which is that the government will say we tried very hard for a deal, we worked with our friends and neighbours in Ireland. If it didn't work out, whose fault is it? You know, is it those evil EU, or is it Ireland making too many demands? I mean, there's a lot to play for in terms of a blame game that's coming, and as I say, to set up this final battle between the people and the establishment.
And when you talked about the clash that could be coming this week, just want to look at Saturday. Saturday the 19th is the date when Parliament has said, and it's law, if there's no deal, the British Prime Minister has to ask for a delay. Boris Johnson really does not want to do that. What happens?